This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was getting frustrated by your forms. Now Taxes is uploading your forms with a snap, and a TurboTax expert will do your taxes for you. One who's backed by the latest tech, which cross-checks millions of data points for absolute accuracy. All of which makes it easy for you to get the most money back, guaranteed. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
Kroger Delivery has one mission: to deliver the freshest food right to your door. That's why our drivers are pros. Our trucks are refrigerated. And when it comes to low prices, we always deliver. With $20 off your first order of $75 or more, there's no better time to get in on the action. Mission accomplished. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. We're back. It's been a little gap. We've done our top 10 drivers of the season. We got all of our post-season stuff out of the way, had a little break. Not much of a break for either of us, to be honest. We've both been extremely busy, but very happy to be back just before Christmas to bring you, hopefully, a little bit of holiday cheer. JR Hildebrand alongside me. JR, it's been a long time, and although there's a lot of IndyCar stuff that's happened since we recorded last, there's only one question that I want to ask you. It's a very, very simple question. How cool was it to drive the Hot Wheels NASCAR around a track and just take that somewhere where motorsport fans were, to just take all of that in? It was awesome. And if you've not seen this, by the way, just go to JR's social media, as you should anyway, and check out him driving his Kyle Petty Hot Wheels NASCAR, because it's very, very cool. How cool was that on a scale of like 1 to 10?
That was an 11, man. I mean, it was it's just, I mean, it was actually the first time driving that car was the first time that I've driven some stock car-ish stuff, but never somewhere that I was familiar with, and never really like a true blue. Like, it's always been just like, hey, I need you to get in and like shake this thing down or something, you know? And so, a very different experience and a more complete experience, I guess, driving that thing. I mean, I was, that car raced 97 through 99. I was 9, 10, 11. I mean, I literally sat in the turn 2 grandstands and watched that car, cheered for that car at Sears Point. So, for that to be the first place I ended up going and driving, it was just a really cool experience. And it's funny that, I've said on the podcast a number of times that every time I go drive something new, I just think like, why have I not been doing this for longer? This definitely ranked in that category. You hear all kinds of stuff about, especially older stock cars. They're like, these things are just big piles of shit. That's kind of the overwhelming response that you get from people. But it's like the most lovable big pile of shit that you've ever driven. It's like, it had a freshly rebuilt SB2, Jericho 4-speed, just raw but fast as hell. Like it was super fun. Like it was shitty in a super fun way, which is what you kind of look for. And you don't care about the lap time really. Like, you're just out there with a bunch of other stock cars, so it doesn't really, that part of it doesn't matter at all. And I had a blast. It was a lot of fun. So and I will say, like, had a lot of help too. Like, was texting back and forth with Ray Evernham about trying to figure out getting set up on this thing, and you're just trying to get it in the window, so you sort of know that you're not just missing something huge when you get out there. And texting back and forth with me, he goes, well, you know what, like, I'll dig through my stuff and I'll see what I got. And then 10 minutes later, like, how a guy like that comes up with this type of thing just out of thin air, I have no idea. But 10 minutes later, I got an email. He was like, check your email. Got the 1998 pole sitting setup sheet from Jeff Gordon Hendrick Motorsports crew back in the day. So just a lot of little cool stuff like that. Some help from Justin Marks and the Trackhouse guys to get the car like dialed in. Just fun to delve into like a whole different part of the industry and start to get to know it a little bit. Through this, I don't know, kind of like, to me, it's like an iconic car, and still holds up. Like, it's, you rolled it out, and to the number of people, particularly who are my age, who were just amped to see this thing back out on track was really cool. So looking forward to doing a little more with it next year.
I feel like a lot of the kind of stock car development over your kind of younger years to where we are now, obviously a lot's happened under the cars, but I feel like there's always like you can look back at a stock car and it kind of looks similar and doesn't look like it's been developed as much as maybe like similar periods in Formula One or in single seaters, and that kind of makes the nostalgia value of being a kid to driving that car for the first time even more cool, that, it just seems that little bit closer rather than it seeming like, you go from seeing what an IndyCar looked like in the early 90s to then driving one in the early 2010s, and it's like a different sport basically. So that I love that for you, that was that you got to get out in the car. So that's awesome. And Ray Evernham helped you as well, the setup sheet. That's so cool. He's awesome. He's so cool to interview and such a cool guy. If you ever get a chance to listen to some podcasts with him and some videos, definitely check them out, especially because Jeff Gordon's got such a bad memory. I know Jeff won't mind me saying that, but because Jeff's got such a bad memory, Ray Evernham's things like him pulling out a setup sheet from 98 makes up for it. Yeah, if you speak to Jeff, you have to speak to Ray to balance it all out, so that's cool. Anyway, let's get into some IndyCar stuff. I guess the point of this episode is to pick out some of the things that we're looking forward to watching in 2025. That's quite a loose term. It could mean anything: drivers, teams, themes, stuff to do with the series, whatever. So I wanted to start with McLaren, because one of the biggest stories that broke while we've been off air was Gavin Ward leaving McLaren, a team decision basically, although it was mutual. He's obviously gone in a different direction. We don't know where he's going yet, but we know that he's no longer the team manager or technical director or whatever it is you want to call his role that he was doing before. Gavin Ward, someone we both know relatively well, JR, and have spoke to a fair bit on the pod, and always someone we kind of seek out in the paddock and interesting to hear from. Obviously worked for Red Bull for a long time in Formula One under the likes of Adrian Newey. He's done aero stuff, he's done race engineering. He's also, won an IndyCar championship with Josef Newgarden and done a lot of things in his career. But it was a big surprise to see him go, and that he's not really going to be replaced. It's going to be like a committee type system like they use in Formula One. But the team also interested in the sense that we've got Christian Lundgaard coming in, who has done a great job in his first 3 seasons in IndyCar, but without doubt faces his toughest test of going up against the team built around Pato O'Ward, this, what has been quite a difficult car to drive at times, and Pato seems to be the one who can get the most out of it, and he seems to be a bit of a teammate killer in his career so far at McLaren, Pato. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Christian gets on. I think he can go in and do a really good job there. I'm not saying he won't, but it's just if we look at what's happened previously, it's a tough job for Christian to go into. JR, I know you're keen to talk about McLaren. Where do you want to start with this, and where do you want to take us?
Well, I'm keen to talk about it just because I think that there's just a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of uncertainty around how this is all going to shake out. And, on the one hand, you could sort of look at the Formula One side of things and say, well, it wasn't that long ago that they sort of looked to be in a similar situation, that you had Andreas Seidel left, and you sort of think of him as being the kingpin of the technical side of what's going on, and is this going to all fall apart? And they kind of had, and it seemed like it was basically like their performance was absolutely nowhere. And then sort of out of nowhere, first, third of this year, basically, they just suddenly were firing on all cylinders and managed to get it going. So I'm honestly not convicted enough about what the takeaway is there, or what the insight is in terms of how that worked. But I guess it's for as many personnel oriented decisions within the broader McLaren, family, you could say, have seemed questionable. At least on that side of things, they have managed to get it to where they are one of the top 2 or 3 highest performing teams on the grid in a fairly short order. So I guess As much as a lot of this on the surface would have me sort of, and I think has a lot of people sitting here wondering, like, what the hell is going on? Like, how is this possibly better, than where they've been set up? It seems like they were, in essence, knocking on the door and just in need of a little more time and a few more resources to kind of be able to break through and really genuinely be, a top three, I would say, team, elevating themselves above even Andretti at this point. This seems likely, this just on the surface of it seems like this is going to incur a step back, but I don't know. I mean, there's been enough turmoil that has ended up turning into performance for McLaren broadly over the years that maybe we're just kind of like not seeing the forest through the trees here. Like we obviously don't know what the end game is or what the real plan is here, if there is one. So I'm hesitant to just say I think like everything's we should be looking forward to a year that's a complete rebuilding situation and that it's going to be turmoil and chaos for these guys, but it is certainly unclear what the broader plan is, and that I think that uncertainty is just generally not a good thing within motorsport organizations. So I think I bring it up mainly just to point out that there's a lot to be looking at here and trying to kind of decipher who, if anybody, on the leadership of the current kind of leadership organization at McLaren is going to. You've got Tony Kanaan, who has taken much more of a front and center role. You've got Barnhart and Scott Harner and, some other kind of old heads who have been around and been team managers and, held a bunch of different roles at different teams and kind of seen how it's done. I think ultimately in the IndyCar series, one thing that you can say is that although there has certainly been progression in terms of where performance comes from, the fact that the car fundamentally hasn't changed in like over a decade and the support from the manufacturers is kind of the same as what it's always been, I'm not sure that there's a need to be highly innovative in terms of how you perform at a high level as a team. And we've even heard that from the likes of Gavin Ward, that it's kind of like, well, until we can do the things that Penske and Ganassi can do behind the scenes, like we probably just won't be quite at their level. Like there's not a lot of ways around that. But it's just, yeah, it feels to me like there's a gap that at some point is going to need to be filled here. And we don't really know how it's hard. It's really hard to predict how that's going to work itself out.
Well, you pointed to the F1 side. They've got the 3 technical directors, and Zach Brown sees it working in a similar way in IndyCar, except not necessarily with 3 technical directors, but I guess it's 4 heads, because you've got Tony Kanaan, who's the deputy team principal. You've got Brian Barnhart as the general manager. Scott Harner, you mentioned, who's the director of racing operations, and Nick Snyder, who's the technical director. So you've got those people reporting into Zach Brown, who makes the final decision if there's any kind of indecision about how to do things. So I guess in that sense, it works similar to the F1 team, with Zach Brown acting as Andrea Stella in that sense. But like you said, it's not, you can't copy and paste the Formula One system there in the same sense over to IndyCar. It just doesn't work because, there's no aerodynamic director, because there's not any aerodynamic development going on in IndyCar necessarily, in terms of obviously the bodywork and the parts are not changing. So yeah, it's complicated, and we'll have to see how that one plays out. It's going to be really interesting, and I think you picked out some good points there. I'm also interested just on the driver side. I mentioned Lundgaard and Pato as well. I think those two are it's going to be interesting to see how they work together, how they push each other forward, whether Christian can kind of buck this trend of being a teammate of Pato who can also produce at his level, even if he's just competing for podiums on a more regular basis, or a similar basis to Pato. Then that would be a great success, I think, for McLaren if they can access that. But we've also got the story of Nolan Siegel coming in. I think we're going to have to give him some more slack again for the first half of the season, because he's quite a lot of the tracks at the start of the season he's not going to have been to before and not competed at before. So I think a good amount of slack in the first half of the season, but certainly in the second half of the season and going into 2026, I'd like to see him, showing the faith that McLaren put in him, and showing that he was worth not going with Théo Pourchaire to have him in the seat. So as you pointed out, all of the things happening behind the scenes as well, some really interesting kind of driver moves going on there, some not just driver moves as well, but some interesting sort of dynamics between the drivers there, and they've all got relative things to prove. Lundgaard needs to come in and do a good job against Pato. Nolan needs to step it up definitely in the second half of next year and be a bit closer to those two. But Pato as well also needs to have a consistent season and show that he can fight Alex below, because I think on any given day we'd put Pato up there with the fastest drivers in the series, and maybe on some days he's even the fastest, and some of his qualifying performances would certainly point to that. But we've also seen, like the same problem that we have when we talk about some of the Andretti drivers, we've seen inconsistency on the team side, whether it be reliability or strategy or pit work and stuff like that. Those things that Penske and Ganassi are kind of automatic in and seem to rarely make any mistakes in. We've seen those things go wrong for the likes of McLaren and Andretti on their side as well. So it's so hard to judge where Pato's at and where he should be at in a team that isn't Penske or Ganassi, in the sense of you're trying to work out whether he is the best driver in the series. Is he top 5? Is he just top 10? It's really hard to kind of balance all that out and work out where they're at. But it's going to be really interesting to see where all those fall. So definitely we'll keep an eye on Arrow McLaren for the 2025 IndyCar season. Another team, while we're on the subject of teams, JR, Prema, I wanted to talk about them a little bit because they're obviously coming in for their first season of IndyCar in 2025. I'm sure there'll be a lot of eyes on them, not just from North America, but also from Europe, where a lot of their base is. Obviously, they compete in Formula 2 and Formula 3, and a lot of the junior single-seater championships that are based in Europe, their team out of Italy and have set up their own base in Indy. I know we've both heard a lot about the staff that are coming in, JR, and who's working there. I guess the most famous one being Mike Cannon's come over from Foyt to, I guess, work as a technical director at the Prema team. Although I don't think there's been any official confirmation from the team itself yet, but we know Mike Cannon's in there. We're probably not sure exactly what his role is going to be, but have a vague idea. Also, Callum Ilott and Robert Schwartzman coming over as well as the drivers. I guess my question to you is, to kick this off, JR, would be, is bringing in someone like Mike Cannon, who's obviously got so much experience of IndyCar and a driver that has experience of IndyCar, enough to kind of shortcut some of the learnings that they're going to have here? Or do you think it's just not that simple and there's going to be, so much to this for Prema to adapt to this series? Because I guess I ask in the context of a lot of people are just expecting them to come in and be competitive immediately, and I don't know what competitive looks like to everybody, but I guess like somewhere around 10th in the championship, 10th to 15th maybe, and like regularly competing for top 10s, maybe the odd in with a chance of a win, podium, top 5 kind of situation, like you might expect from a Hunkos or somebody like that. And I'm just wondering, does bringing in some of these names that we've talked about shortcut some of that, or are we expecting them to struggle a little bit in the first half of the season and take a bit of time to adapt here? I'm kind of interested in, I know you've maybe not been in this exact situation before, but with your experience of teams and stuff and how the IndyCar series works, I'm interested what you think might be the outcome there.
Well, I think basically it's really hard. We talked about this with McLaren. It's really hard to beat Penske and Ganassi right now. And it's just going to keep getting harder. Like that's not going to, as things progress, they just figure stuff out faster than everybody else does. And so any team that doesn't have the full array of resources, you look at IndyCar as a spec series and you sit there and go, okay, well, yeah, there are definitely aspects of it being a spec series that make it so that it's definitely possible to just nail the setup and have the right guy in the seat and call the right strategy and not have your pit stops get screwed up or not have that cost you, serious time or something, and you're standing on the podium at the end of a race. I mean, that is the beauty of the IndyCar series, and we've seen that happen, right? Like you've seen, a Juncos, whatever. You've seen these kinds of teams manage to pull these types of results out here and there.
I guess Shank is a perfect example as well, isn't it? I guess because they're relatively new and have done a similar kind of thing.
Sure. The other aspect of that, though, is I think this is where you look at Shank and you look at Foyt, and some of these teams, we'll take Foyt as an example because that's where Cannon was last, that you in theory have everything that Penske's got, and in Foyt's case, some leftovers of what Ganassi had also, and we're just scraping the bottom of the barrel to be in the top 10 at the end of the season. And you could talk about Santino versus whatever, Callum or Robert Schwartzman or something. The reality for those guys, though, is that Robert's just going to be, everything's going to be new to him. So regardless of how good he is, this is not a situation that you're stepping into and just going to go kick everyone's ass or something. Like that is not going to occur. If he is as good as we think he might be, then there's definitely going to be instances. There are going to be races where he could be surprisingly good. It just doesn't take away the fact that there's newness to get used to, that there's a bunch of other also really good guys that don't have to get used to any of that same stuff. So I think one of the things broadly, I guess, that I'm trying to point out here is just that the level overall by everybody on the team that is required right now to stand on the podium at the end of a race, we'll say truly on merit, in the IndyCar series is just extraordinarily high. Like, it's a combination, the optimization for every moment over the course of a race weekend that's required to do that, including every second of the race, like literally every decision that everybody is making over the course of a race to beat Dixon, Palou, Newgarden, McLaughlin, Power, just those five guys basically, is pretty extraordinary. So, and I guess the secondary part of that is we've even seen the teams that have access to a lot of that stuff just not be able to do it. And so then you get another step removed from that, and you add the fact that they're, as a team, going to be getting their act together through the year. Like, there's just an element, that they are in essence standing up truly an IndyCar team, like people who are experienced in IndyCar. Like, the Prema IndyCar team is going to look like they're going to look like an IndyCar team that has already existed in essence at some point, like just mashed together in a different group of people and equipment and stuff. So I don't think that, so they'll sort of, in a lot of ways, I think this will look the same as any upstart IndyCar team might look at this point. But I just don't think there's a way to be an upstart IndyCar team at this point that doesn't have a serious teething period from a performance point of view. So I think a proxy here is kind of like, look at what Grosjean did in his first year or two in the series, just as a general, like, he came from, be a European pedigree and came in as a very highly rated driver, at least in kind of certain swim lanes. He was able to show out in those places just kind of purely on his talent and an engineer with him that gave him what he was looking for on a handful of occasions throughout the year. But I think that's probably my expectation for the ceiling of what we should, not necessarily Grosjean's results from that year, but just kind of that general point of view is I think what's most likely to see from this team, just given the pedigree and existing performance level of everybody else.
I think Grosjean's ceiling of competing for podiums, almost winning a race and grabbing a pole or two would be pretty nice for Prema.
Whether you're ordering wings for the game, whipping up a 7-layer dip, or ordering pizza, there's something about football that makes you want to eat. And this football season, Uber Eats has the best deals on game day food. No matter what you're craving, from 2-for-1 pizza to buy one, get one wings, Uber Eats will be dropping new deals each week, all season long. Uber Eats, official on-demand delivery partner of the NFL. Order now. Terms and conditions apply. See app for details.
Right, JR, we're still kind of on the team theme here, but I'm going to direct us away from that quite quickly in a second. But obviously, probably the biggest news story to break in our little gap, obviously the Cadillac Formula One program starting to take shape. We won't go too much into that because we're not a Formula One podcast, and you can go and listen to the Race's Formula One podcast, and it's many podcasts about that subject, and it'll go into a lot more detail than we're able to here. But I guess it does have impact on the IndyCar side because we're expecting Michael Andretti to step back further, at least from where he has been in recent years in IndyCar. We've got Doug Ducart coming in what's his role? He's Chief Performance Officer at Andretti, or TWG, whatever it ends up being called moving forward, and how all that kind of shakes out. I guess the point there is there's a lot we don't know about what's going to happen in terms of the Andretti team moving forward, what that might look like and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I guess I'm just interested I think there's always a period where I think Michael Andretti's done a phenomenal job for that team and wouldn't take away anything from the achievements, the ability, everything that he's done and everyone around him has done in that team in terms of the success that they've earned in IndyCar and what they've been able to do. But part of me is a believer in that. I think sometimes when you shake things up, even if you're moving incredible people out of the way to do something different, it can help and it can refresh the organisation and help things move in a different direction that it maybe didn't know it needed, or that it will just generally benefit from having someone different kind of in charge, a different structure, especially in the context of IndyCar teams becoming so much more structured, kind of moving away from that. I don't want it to be an offensive way of putting it, but, like moving away from a car chief who would oversee the kind of hands-on work that would go on the car, and now we're moving much more towards like a technical director who's overseeing all of the simulation and all of the managing all of the tools that we have access to now, where the sport's just become so much more complicated than it used to be, or at least we've got tools that have made it more complicated than it used to be. So I'm kind of interested if you kind of agree with the fact that we're not taking away anything that Michael Andretti has done, but this kind of structural change that we might see at Andretti, where he needs to be replaced and there needs to be a different structure in place for that team to work. So, at least the people I've spoke to on the inside say that they're obviously all sad to see Michael stepping back to a certain extent, but are really excited about the opportunity moving forward to maybe do something slightly different, to maybe not copy what other teams have done, because I think in a certain extent Andretti looks quite similar to Penske and Ganassi in terms of its makeup. You've got one person who owns the team, and then they've put really good people in place that run different elements of the team, and that's why those teams have been so successful, and that obviously won't change. But I guess all of that is to say that I don't see this as, even though it's sad to see Michael stepping back to a certain extent, that it's necessarily doom and gloom there, and that there's an opportunity to do something a bit different, and to maybe for the team to keep improving, because they did so well last year, shrinking down to 3 cars, putting all the focus on those 3 cars. Colton Herta was a championship contender. Kyle Kirkwood wasn't far off, and I think if just a couple of days had have gone slightly different, he might have had a couple of wins in there as well, and his championship would have looked totally different too. And we know Marcus Ericsson had a really tough first year at the team through a few mistakes himself, some very, very bad luck in places that made that year look, quite a bit worse than it probably was. But I guess, let's say the overarching theme I have is that there's potential for a lot of positivity here, and that across maybe a little bit of change here, just sharpening things up, and the form that Colton had last year, I think they could really go on and challenge and do some good things this year. And I'm quite excited to see how that plays out, especially after what I feel like is a few years of kind of missed opportunities of having someone as good as Colton there, having some other good drivers as well, and just not being able to quite match the level that Penske and Ganassi had been at. And last year felt like the first time in a long time that I felt Andretti were actually competing at that level, and were actually, even if they didn't beat Ganassi and Penske every week or in the championship, they were on that level and they were performing to that level. So I'm quite excited to see how they get on this year.
I am too, and I agree with a lot of your comments. It's something that I've thought a little bit about, over this period where, it seems like Michael is going to be coming back. I obviously have a bit of personal experience having been there. I won my Indy Lights championship with them, and Michael was really involved in that. Mm-hmm. He was somebody who was intimately involved in kind of that effort, and he was the reason that I got a bunch of IndyCar test days through that period and all that kind of stuff. So I have a lot of respect for Michael, and he's been a part of my personal journey, from kind of the junior formula up into IndyCar. And it's interesting, and everybody kind of grows and changes and evolves over time. So he's not the same person, now as he was then, and neither am I. But I think it's interesting just to reflect on what him, and I guess I say this with a bit of personal experience, and then sort of extrapolating a little bit more to kind of how this manifests at a higher level, like in a more modern day context or a more contemporary context in terms of the way the team operates and stuff. But I think that when you have somebody who's a racer at the helm, and so that you've got these different kind of archetypes for the types of people that run these teams. You've got people who are, businessmen, you've got technical folks, you've got, and in the odd scenario, you've got racers. And Michael is like a racer's racer. He's not Gilles de Ferran, he's not Bobby Rahal, like, he's Michael Andretti. Like, this is a guy who, you had no issue at any point in his career just closing the visor and shutting everything out and going and ripping the lap. Like, that's kind of who he was. Like, I feel like he was in a good way, he was, as a race car driver, he was not a hyper cerebral guy. He was not, he was somebody who extracted performance by it just being there for him when he could kind of tap into, his skill and talent at the highest level. And I think that what that can create for within an organization is a heightened ability for the drivers and even some of the other people on the team to do that same thing, right? Is like to be able to, and I feel like you've kind of seen that at Andretti over the years, that there's just this sort of like you get these just incredible performances from people that kind of come out of nowhere, that are just, and that even the team has operated at times like, how in the hell is, I mean, we forget that Andretti was like unquestionably the team that you had to knock off the top at Indianapolis for like a long stretch, for a number of years in a row, that it was like they were going to stick a car they were Ganassi or Penske, as we think of them now, at that place. Like, you were going to have to beat them, and that they were bringing like 6 cars to the dogfight, like that it was just a crazy thing to have to overcome. And so, and that's thinking back to kind of like Fernando's first, that time period, sort of we'll call it 2012 through 2017 or something, kind of a 5-year stretch through there, that particularly through that period, that they were just, almost, it felt unbeatable. It felt inevitable that they were going to be the ones that were, had a bunch of cars in the fight at the end of the race. And so, but the flip side, so on the one hand, when you have somebody like that who was capable of doing those things, and I think they sort of come in essence with an expectation that all of the other individuals on the team can rise to that occasion, rise to that level when the time comes, basically. And that sometimes you see that manifest itself in ways that you get this ultra optimized, like even over optimized, like level of performance from people, because there's kind of, on the one hand, maybe an expectation that that's possible to do, but then it creates in a way like a belief that it is possible, and that you can just, to hell with it, chips are down, we're going to go, lay it down. That there's, the other version of that is, sometimes if you're overly data driven about it, you can kind of get bogged down by just all the reasons why you're not going to perform at a super high level, because you're inundated with the fact that the chips are down and that, the odds are against you. But I think the flip side to that is, when it's like that, then sometimes you're not just in process weekend to weekend to elevate the foundation of like what you're there to do and what you're capable of, and the things that you need to have at your disposal in the way that everybody actually just needs to be able to operate on like a day-to-day basis, whether that be at the racetrack or whatever, so that you don't have to reach quite so high or quite so far to be in contention for the championship at the end of the year, or in contention for Indianapolis 500 wins or whatever. And so that is not that I say that I purposefully in more of a generalized sense, because I don't I don't have enough experience or insight to say that that's what's going on here, or that is what has occurred with Michael Andretti at the helm here. But I do think that if you take him away, but you say this team does have the financial resources and the ability to kind of fill that void with, probably it's just going to be with somebody who's has a different background, who if they have access to the right people and the right mentality on that side, I guess I would say it's very likely that it's just somebody who has more structure from kind of an organizational perspective in mind. Michael Andretti has built an ability to understand what that structure is over just by having done it now for a long time. But that's not really where he comes from in terms of his leadership kind of strategy and style. His leadership strategy and style is and will forever be that of a racer. I think like that's just. So I guess I kind of bring all these things up to say, like, there's a lot to like about that, but it may just be, to your point, that it's time for this team to have something different in terms of what the top-down ideology in terms of how we go about this is. And I think it's exactly to your point. It's possible that like takes a little whack off of the peaks of what you see, but elevates like the foundation of kind of just general competitiveness here. And I also think that there's an element to that could come across as like, okay, everybody, it's time to get serious. Like we are not going to go about this relying on a primal ability to just will ourselves to the front here. And it's like, it's not to say that is the way that people think, but if you get even further away from that, then I do think it changes the overall mentality to a degree within a team that should have the tools to run up front every weekend, basically.
I think in some respects, the kind of person that you've outlined is perfect for like a Dale Coyne, who, not to, offend Dale Coyne or offend Michael Andretti, but when you've got one IndyCar team, you can really focus on that. You can, that can be your full focus. You're dedicated to it. You have enough time to be across all of that stuff. But Andretti is now the only team in the world that has a Formula E team, an IndyCar team, a NASCAR team, and a sports car team. So, I think Michael's probably realised that he's asking a lot of himself to be able to manage all of those things and be the best person to manage all of those things individually as well. Sometimes you just have to step back and say there's a better person to do this, or I don't have the time to do this, and that somebody needs to put in place. So, yeah, I think overall, this is going to be a move that the organisation had to make, whether that was with Michael stepping back or whether Michael was going to take a different role or, move into something different. I think there was always going to be a point where this happened, where the size of the organisation outgrew the amount of work that he was doing. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how they get on. And Herta's kind of part of the Holy Trinity. We'll get onto the third in a sec, but kind of addressing the underlying theme of the pod, I guess, who can challenge Alex Palou. We've mentioned Pato O'Ward and what he needs to do and what McLaren needs to do to get him into that position. And Herta at Andretti is another one where, they need to have a strong year to be competing against Palou and Penske as well, but definitely have the ability to do it. And we'll be keeping an eye on which one of those drivers is able to produce that consistency and come to the fore. The other lot, I guess, will be Penske and who kind of jumps out there. I mean, to me, Josef Newgarden's always the most interesting person in that team, and that's no surprise on this pod with you being his ex-teammate and me being generally fascinated by Josef Newgarden in lots of different ways. But I guess there's two questions for me here. Is the first is just to spin this to the Indy 500 for a minute. Can he make it 3 in a row? And what kind of... It's always easier for me to believe that someone can win a third than a second, if that makes sense. It's like if they've done 2, then that one more feels easier than doing it for a second time and defending it, because it seems impossible that you defend the Indy 500. It's just, you're just not allowed to do it. But then when you do it, it's like, oh, okay, could this person go and win 3? Could they go and win 4? Like it for me, it kind of broadens the horizons of what's possible and makes me believe that it is. So that's one part of this I'm interested in, JR, whether you think he can do a third and what might be the I guess the stumbling blocks and what might not be for that. But also, I'm kind of interested in, you know, where we kind of rate Josef at the moment and how big a year 2025 is for him, because he's been beaten by Scott McLaughlin in the championship for the past 2 years. And I think both of us would sit here now and say that we don't think Josef Newgarden is necessarily a worse driver than Scott McLaughlin, or at least we wouldn't use the stand-ins to, you know, bounce off it which one of those is the best or something. Like, you know, the IndyCar Championship's much more complicated than that, isn't it? But I think if you go back 3 or 4 years, very few people would argue with you that Josef Newgarden was the best all-round IndyCar driver in the series, even though he hadn't won the Indy 500 at that point. It's like the one thing that he needed to tick off. But we've got to a point now where Palou's racked up these 3 championships, and it's come at a time where Newgarden's road and street course form hasn't been as strong as it has been previously. And I think now, if you made the argument that Josef Newgarden was the best all-round IndyCar driver in the series, a lot of people would say, hang on a minute, you know, look at what Alex Palou's been able to do. And obviously we have to, you know, back that against the fact that Josef's driving for different teams with a different group of people. It's a different set of circumstances, but at the same time, we're talking about sport here and who's the best, and we have to compare all of these people, and it's part of, you know, what people want to do and what people have to do, right? So I'm kind of interested in terms of the 500 whether we think he can do it again, and also how big a year is 2025 Josef Newgarden. And I feel like if he retired at the end of 2025, people would still call him an IndyCar great, and he would still go down as one of the best drivers of his generation. But I think if he can rebound in 2025 and show that he's still got that road and street course performance, then there's still a lot for him to go on and do here, and so much more for him to add to that resume.
Yeah, I think to try to kind of cut through it, I'd say, like, can he go win a third? Absolutely. Like, he's the odds-on favorite to win the race. We know that there's a million reasons why he might not do it. So it's, you know, so I think he's going to necessarily? Like, I wouldn't go as far as saying that, but I guess I would say there's absolutely no reason in my mind to think that somebody else has surpassed him as being the favorite for it. So he's definitely the favorite, because Penske is still going to be great there, and he has not lost a step. There's in any way, shape, or form, certainly not there. And he's in essence proven 2 years in a row that in different sets of circumstances that he's built for this race. The way that this race works right now, the things that you have to be good at is like they are all in Josef Newgarden's wheelhouse. So, and in a way that I don't really think that there's not somebody else that you look at and say, there's other guys that maybe are a little better at certain things, but the race just doesn't play out really in ways that cater to those other things. You know, like this is not really like Scott Dixon's race anymore. I don't feel like, you know, just the way that the race works out. And it's not to say that Scott still has all the requisite kind of skills and talent and reaction and I say reaction just in terms of like mental reaction, you know, like psychological reading a situation and kind of picking the right thing to do. He obviously finished third last year, so he was right in the mix. He was the highest finishing Ganassi car on a year that they frankly took kind of a step back. But I wouldn't at this point sit there and say you could pick out some things that Scott Dixon might be better than Josef at. They're just not things that I think matter a lot at Indianapolis at this point. You know, the things that Josef is really good at, which we've seen him be really good at them at a lot of places, and particularly on the big super speedways, you know, in the last 5 years or something. Those are the things that count for the most, basically. So for those reasons, yeah, no question about it, he could go win a third. Where is he at for the rest of the year? Yeah, I think it's kind of one of those things that you have to, if you really look at the last couple of years and his performances, you'd have to sit there and go, yeah, he definitely, there has not been the consistency of form on road and street circuits, and that kind of starts and ends basically with qualifying. That his race pace at all of those places has been as good as anybody's, almost every race. Like there has not been an event where more often than not, actually, he's been sort of clearly the fastest guy, and just because they didn't qualify well, or they or they end up on like making a strategy call that kind of isn't high odds because they're not in the catbird seat in terms of the way that things are working out, because they're not running up front at the beginning. You just haven't had these things play out. So really, in the bigger scheme of things, there's no lack of pace here to be concerned with. He hasn't been able to go find it as frequently in qualifying. I think you kind of say that for almost anybody. Like, it's just become, there's who is the best qualifier in the IndyCar series. I guess you'd probably say at this point on road and street courses, it's not Josef Newgarden, but who is it? Like, I don't know, it's all over the place. So I think there's been a little bit of that they just haven't ended up actually executing the races well enough, or he's made small mistakes, and that's partially on him too. Like, that's not just the team or strategy calls or whatever, but there's been a lot of just like there's been a handful of unforced errors and a lot of just kind of wrong place, wrong time, or strategic misses that have kept him from being a really serious championship contender over the last couple of years. And for me, that's just like, just go back and look at it. Like, that's not because I'm, buddies with Josef or something, and you could say a lot of those same things for like a bunch of different guys. Like, there's a bunch of drivers that the reason that they haven't, that they could have been, coulda, woulda, shoulda, like in slightly different situations, been more legitimately a contender against Alex Palou, or stayed in that hunt for longer, or whatever. So I guess my tune with Josef here, just in the big scheme of things, I don't think is changing much, which is, I think he's basically still the guy that has the most to throw at a challenge to Alex Palou. Basically, he's the most different from Alex Palou in terms of the way that he creates for performance and results, than any of the other guys that are kind of in the same boat. He and Colton, basically, to me, are the two guys that have kind of proven an ability to do a few things better and differently enough that they might actually, like, should those things really be the things that count, and they could be, and a lot of this has to do with their prowess on ovals, and their ability to like just kind of take risks. I think their risk tolerance on ovals is just a little higher, and they manage to, and you could throw Pato into this, and like the three of those guys basically just manage to make it work all the time. I mean, those are the three guys to me that kind of show, well, actually, everybody else should be reevaluating what their risk tolerance is. Not necessarily that they're out here just getting lucky every time, because they do it enough that it's just not that. So anyway, Josef to me, I think, still has kind of the full package, and I think he's in for himself, as kind of enlightened a state of everybody can go F themselves, basically, as you can be. Those two things don't always go together, but there is a version of them that go together. So I think he'll be as serious a contender as he's ever been this upcoming year. And I think now with, he's racked 2 championships. He's now racked 2 Indy 500 wins. He's got absolutely nothing to prove. And that frankly, for everything else, if he can really embrace that, that's a dangerous combination for everyone else, basically. So I think I'll sort of shift this into, I guess, the other thought that I have along with this, just in terms of who's out there that can beat Alex Palou, that this year for me is like, regardless of what their situations are, kind of like it's go time for Pato, Colton, and Scott McLaughlin. Like it's not to say that there should be the expectation that any of those three guys are going to go absolutely beat Alex Palou or Josef Newgarden, for that matter. If one or the other of those guys is just absolutely on point every race, we know that both of those drivers, I'd still rank basically both of those guys as the guys that you need to beat. Like they sort of have just they've actually showcased over a period of time. They are our kind of most recent champions. They've showcased over a period of time, and then you've got Will Power and Scott Dixon as kind of the remainders of the old guard that in essence still show that the experience that they have over, you know, in the IndyCar series, which now Alex and Josef, I almost look at Alex and Josef as just kind of, they don't have quite all of the things that Scott and Will have, but they're sort of just being younger guys. They're a little bit of like the upgraded versions of those dudes. They've both had a lot of experience in the series at this point. They've both won multiple championships. They know how to get it done. You've got this sort of younger crop of elite stars in the series that it just feels like it's time for one of these guys to truly break through. And I think they could all do it. Like they all have the ceiling to be able to do it. And it might, for any of them to actually do it, it might require that we see just something absolutely incredible from them over the course of the entire season. But I just like, it's time to see that occur, you know?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think just to finish the thought on Josef, I think I would still argue that he's the best all-round driver in the series. And I would be happy arguing that with anyone. I just know that if I had that argument now with some, for example, I don't know this for fact, but if I was to bring this argument up at the race or with IndyCar friends or people in motorsport, that argument would be a lot harder now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And that, you know, you have a responsibility to look into these things before you start making big observations about how someone's better or worse than they were 2 years ago, or that, you know, making general points like they're not as good on road and street courses as they were 2 or 3 years ago, because, as you said, so much goes into that. But then the other person will always say, well, you know, that the other person that they're talking about has had a lot of bad luck as well, and we'll measure their performances against them. And you just get into this kind of circle that never ends of like arguing about who you think's had the worst luck or things haven't gone right for them. But I think having watched every IndyCar race over the past, you know, X number of years as you have and I have as well, not quite as many as you, but definitely a substantial amount, that I would still say that I think Josef is the most all round. But I think it's a big year for shushing some of the haters and showing what he is capable of doing and being that guy who can go and take it to Alex Palou. I think the big thing is there that the 10 crew doesn't quite get the credit that it deserves for its role in Palou's success, as good as, you know, you're always afraid to say it because you don't want to take anything away from what Alex Palou has been able to do and what he's been able to achieve. But at the same time, you can't really do that without then in turn not giving the credit to the 10 crew that they deserve. And their strategy and pit stops are just absolutely incredible year on year, almost every race. Like I honestly cannot think of a single occasion where I think the 10 crew just dropped the strategy in a race. Whereas I think I could probably do that for every other car in the series, maybe. Just thinking about it now, at least if we just consider the championship contenders, I can think of at least 2 or 3 examples for all of them. So this is not to say that it hasn't happened, because I'm obviously not going back and looking at every race, but the vibe is that the 10 crew doesn't get the credit that it deserves and plays a massive part in Palou's success as well. So if they continue at that rate, and history shows us that they can continue at that rate, that it's going to be very difficult for anyone to beat them. All right, JR, let's round this off quickly. There's about a million other things that we haven't got time to go through in terms of topics that we could get excited about for next year. I'm very interested to see how Juncos get on with all of the incoming people they've got behind the scenes there, but also I think the driver lineup's generally going to be a lot weaker than it has been in previous years with Stingray Robb and Connor Daly there. I think Connor Daly deserved the chance to go in there after his last 5 races of last season. Did a great job there. But it's just an interesting mix of, like, I don't think the lineup's as good driver-wise, but they've got a lot of people who've come in behind the scenes, clearly made some investment. Also lost Yves Turon as well to Ray Hall, which is a big loss, I think, but David Brown coming in is a very interesting one. A lot of F1 experience there and a very good engineer. We've got Alexander Rossi going to Ed Carpenter, which has had a lot of investment, so it's going to be interesting to see if they can sort of make a step forward there. I guess a step back towards being one of the top Chevrolet teams at the 500 and just being a tiny bit better across the board in the other races would be a big success for them. Just looking at what's realistic in terms of the series. We've got Maya Shank and a big story there, I guess. Can they continue their sort of forward trajectory? They've got Ganassi equipment for next year, so theoretically they're going to have all the tools that Ganassi have, everything Alex Palou takes advantage of every week to fight with. Marcus Armstrong going up against Felix Rosenqvist is also really interesting, because I think if Marcus can do a strong job against Felix, then his stock will rise. But if he's not able to do as well as Felix, then I think that's a bit shaky ground in terms of, being able to show, for the future that you're deserving a seat that is a potential race winning, pole winning seat. So I think it's a big year for Marcus Armstrong. We have to ask what's next for Romain Grosjean, because we've only got 2 seats left in the IndyCar series, 2 seats at Dale Coyne Racing. Who knows when we'll find out who those 2 seats will be and when that'll be confirmed. I'm a bit uninspired by that whole thing, because you just sat in a holding pattern at the moment waiting for, you've got a lot of good drivers on the outside looking in, waiting for either a pay driver or a big sponsor to be settled before they actually get, some sort of traction there. So I got to admit, I'm a bit disappointed by how that, not disappointed because it's just a fact of how motorsport works, but it's just uninspiring to me at the moment. When we should be talking about which one of like Rinus VeeKay, Romain Grosjean, Linus Lundqvist, the likes of, should be getting a seat at Coyne. We're kind of waiting for other things to fall into place. But as I said, that's just a fact of motorsport. And I think Rahaal's an interesting story as well, with Louis Foster coming in, the Indy Next champion. But they've got a lot to do. Some people leaving, some people coming in. I think their driver lineup is also generally worse off than it has been in the past. So it's going to be interesting to see how they sort of move forward. But the last one we'll kind of get into in any sort of detail here is, I guess, just the IndyCar series in general and what we're expecting for next year. The bit that interests me the most is we're starting to get some talk about the 2027 chassis now, which, if you've read anything online, mostly probably by Marshall Pruitt over at Race, who's done a great job of breaking some of these stories about the chassis pictures being sent to the team bosses, or a wind tunnel model being in testing, which I find bizarre that there's a wind tunnel model in testing when they haven't decided what the car's going to look like yet. But that's for more intelligent people than me to talk about, JR. But I guess I'm uninspired by what I've seen from the 27 chassis so far. I guess short of strapping you to some sort of torture device, the worst thing that anyone could do to JR Hildebrand was basically show them a rendering of a car that looks quite similar to one that was in 2012 and say that's going to be the 2027 car. So I imagine you've got some quite serious thoughts about this whole thing.
Well, look, man. Yeah, I think when I told you in advance of recording this podcast that I thought one of the top 5 things was sort of IndyCar 2027 WTF, that it was a little more tongue in cheek than it is. But I think that unfortunately right now, I'll bring up just like a couple of points that we've made about other things over the course of this discussion, which is just that uncertainty in motorsports is just a bad thing, kind of wherever it lies. If you're within a team and there's uncertainty about how things are going, you could talk about that in the context of, we discussed that in the context of McLaren, just in terms of like how these things are actually going to work out and what is really leadership structure here. Like that makes it difficult for everybody else to kind of make decisions and fall in line. And even when you have a really clear swim lane in terms of what you're there to do, these, when you're expected to operate at the absolute highest level and you're operating against other teams and organizations that don't have that same uncertainty, it just makes it difficult. There's just no way around it. We talked about it in the context of Dale Coyne not knowing who their driver lineup is. There's just no way that you're firing on all cylinders as a team or eventually as drivers when these things get dragged out this far. 2027 is around the corner. The manufacturers don't know what engines they're building for that new cycle. We don't know whether there's 2 or 1 or 0 or 5 or whatever, on the OEM side. The teams are...
I'm going to guess it's 2.
Yeah. I'm thinking it's a maximum of 2. But we don't know that, but it's in a, I think it's in a, and this is speculation on my part, but I would assume at this point that it's in a window of time that even if it were to be 3 or 4, like net, that's better. But like just not knowing is as big of a problem as the actual number at this point for everybody, because manufacturer budgets are already getting set for that far out about what these organizations are going to be doing. Honda and General Motors have their hands in all kinds of other stuff. I mean, like if this Cadillac thing actually kicks off, who knows what like GM's larger investments in motorsport are going to look like starting next year, let alone further down the line than that. And so it's not to say that this is not to be like doom and gloom about this. Like, the IndyCar series, because you've got Roger Penske here, you've got the Penske group, you've got a lot of other things going on. Like, it's not like it's a house of cards that's going to suddenly fold because they don't figure these things out. But I guess my point of view, as I've stated, I think pretty openly on the podcast over the last few years, is like there is an opportunity to do something really great in this next cycle, like to do something that puts IndyCar on a trajectory that is wholly different than giving us just the same talking points that we have over and over and over again, talking about this now. And I think that requires some vision, a little bit of imagination, and a commitment to a future that we desire and seek to make exciting. And so I guess just broadly, the sort of things that we hear trickling down from what's ahead, they don't really seem to have a lot of that baked in. It feels like a lot of, let's figure out a way to just sort of keep doing what we're doing now, but update things, which just is altogether not super inspiring to me. Like, that's not why you get involved in motorsport. That's why anybody gets involved in motorsport. Like, we're not here to be on the low risk path, and the fact that even with that in mind, that we can't really, that just nobody seems to be able to get a clear answer on, like, well, what is it then? What are we actually going to do? Has its own implications just for everybody across the whole network of, we'll just say, like, the economy of the sport, basically. It's so weird that you have as much interest on the team side as there has ever been basically in the IndyCar series, because in essence, up to this point, it's been this highly accessible thing that if you want to come do it, you can just come and do it. And that relative to other, fractions of the segments of the sport that you would consider kind of tier one, that it's extraordinarily inexpensive to compete in. I just think it's interesting that, now we've got this, the charter system that's in place that in essence removes that accessibility factor. So it is still an inexpensive thing to do, and it kind of enables the teams that are already here to potentially increase their value in terms of like the equity that they have just as being one of those teams. But broadly speaking, I think if I'm assessing IndyCar, and I do assess IndyCar just from a driver's perspective, like, I've had a hell of a time, just to be frank, finding sponsorship for IndyCar, for going IndyCar racing. And the question that begs for me is not, and I think this is the case if you look at it from any of these angles, is, yeah, it would be nicer if the number that I was asking for was less, like if I could go ask for 450 instead of 800, that would be nice. But really, the thing that would make a difference is if this was actually just worth 1.5. If the value proposition for doing this was clear and elevated. And so I feel like, somehow in my mind, from my personal perspective here, there's not like enough being done to ask the question of really, where is like a 2 to 5x value proposition going to come from? And because the answer to that, just in my opinion, is certainly not by continuing to just do some version of what we're doing now, basically, and trying to kind of like clean it up around the edges. So and the reason that I brought this up in sort of our discussion prior to jumping on the pod is just, I think this is this is an underlying thing that is going to, you will see this affect the way that teams operate, the way that sponsorship works, the way that the OEMs are treating things. It's already affecting those things in sort of some different ways. And so 2025 is the year that, depending on how those decisions actually unfold on the series side, you will start seeing that, bubble to the surface, sort of good, bad, or otherwise, over the course of this season.
Yeah. Really fascinating to get your insight. As you said, you're someone who's, we can talk about this till the cows come home on the podcast from a media perspective, journalist perspective, whatever, but, you're there as well. I think it's important for people to remember that you're there in the coalface, trying to put programs together and do stuff in the IndyCar series. So you're not just coming at this from a perspective of someone who's watching IndyCar racing from at home. You're obviously entrenched in the paddock and trying to make things happen in that sense. So yeah, it's a really interesting time, like you said, and I think a lot of it for me would just be solved by just that little bit more communication, and that doesn't mean that all the cards have to be on the table at all times. Roger Penske's come at this from a different angle, where he's been a team boss, where he's probably not wanted things to come out, and is trying to build the best racing car in a way that, well, we've seen him do it. Bring secret engines to the Indy 500 and do all of this cool stuff, and obviously he wouldn't want people finding out about this stuff, and he's famous for being able to keep that stuff secret and rock up at the speedway with a mad pushrod engine that wins the 500 by a ridiculous amount. And I think I don't think anyone's asking for that, the curtains to be totally drawn open to the extent where every fan knows every single detail about how the IndyCar series is run and how, every single decision that's being made in a public setting. But I think there's just a basic level of information about a lot of things, not just necessarily the future direction of the series, but we've talked about it a lot, even just like decisions from stewards in races, so that people know why things are happening the way they are and why decisions are being made and stuff. Simple things like that don't take a lot to get out there. I think all of us would just like to see that tiny little bit more communication. And even from my perspective, I was just looking at Marshall's stories on Racer last week and just thinking how much better this would have been if IndyCar had, like any other series, would have got this information out there on their own before Marshall did, and control the narrative of how that came out. Because all that happened was that Marshall published his story, rightfully so, very good journalism, uncovered a lot of information that hasn't been talked about in public before, which is, doesn't always happen a lot in the IndyCar series these days. Like, Marshall is one of the few people who's doing that, uncovering all of that, tasty information. But the vibe of what he put across from the people who he spoke to was the vibe of those people's opinions. So instead of IndyCar being in control of that topic of conversation and saying, look, we're not totally there with our 2027 car, but here are some of the ideas we have. We're really excited about this, and here are some of the reasons why we're doing it. It's very exciting for us to be able to do these things. We've kept some things similar to keep costs down. You're controlling the narrative of what comes out, and I'm not saying that people should lie about what they're doing, but there are two sides to every story, and I'm sure a lot of what IndyCar is trying to do, they have good reasons for, and are trying to do it in a certain way because they think that is the way forward. In the way that you think changing things a lot would help, they might think keeping certain things the same are going to help, and that's their opinion, and they're entitled to that. But to not communicate a lot of this stuff themselves, it seems a lot like shooting yourself in the foot in opening yourself up to the court of public opinion, when you could maybe control a lot more of this yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, if I'm even to reflect on my own perspective on it, it's in essence just because it's out of a lack of information. I'm sitting here talking to you about it because I don't really know anything. It's not like I have a bunch of insider detail in terms of what's going on. It's part of why I try not to speak with too much conviction about things being right or wrong. But in an absence of having that information to understand what's going on here and why, all anybody is left with is, well, this is kind of what it seems like is going on here on the surface. So if that's not what's happening, it's kind of, to your point, it's IndyCar's responsibility to, for their own benefit, basically, to get ahead of, what's going on here. So it's just, I think to your point, I do agree that just a lack of transparency. And I do think that there is just generally kind of there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes, and maybe there's concern over that appearing to be sort of weakness or something, that like things aren't totally organized, or the things that, IndyCar has been saying they've been expecting to have happen like aren't, or something like that. But I think that's where I, bring up that it's kind of like, okay, well, the time has come to sort of, make it happen here, which is one way or the other. We've all been patiently waiting to kind of allow for the secret pushrod engine to emerge, and it kind of just and maybe it's there, that'd be awesome, but it doesn't seem like that's the direction that things are going, and so that's just making it worse for everybody.
It was hilarious to me that the kind of main predominant suggestion that came out of Marshall's article from the team bosses was that we should build the Adrian Newey Red Bull thing. And my immediate thought for that was, do you understand the concept of what that car is? Because it was basically, if Adrian Newey was let off the leash in Formula One and he could do absolutely anything he wanted with the car, what would he build and what would he make? Do you have any idea what that might cost? Like, do people understand what a Formula One program costs to run year on year?
Even if you're going to make it a spec car, like, do we really think that's the answer?
I mean, that was extremely interesting. But that just shows that everyone has their own opinion, and that some people will disagree with those opinions, and that it's important to have that information out there. And the more information we do get out there, the more constructive opinion you get from the people that you do care about and that you want opinion from. And that's how those ideas are going to be more fully formed when they come to pass, as opposed to us just all commenting on a small piece of information that we've received from one place that wasn't, and I say this again, Marshall does a great job in the information that he's obviously getting out there, and the things that he's finding out, but you need a full picture of all of that kind of stuff if you're a series. And I just wonder if more could be done to get that information out there. But hopefully we've done a good job of getting some information out there on this episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast, and probably in finishing in that way, probably not providing a lot of festive cheer in terms of positivity and stuff moving forward. But what we can absolutely say is that 2025 will be a fantastic year for competition in the IndyCar series. There's no way someone goes out there and blows the rest of the opposition away, is that? Oh, maybe Alex Palou might do that. But we think that there's an opportunity for some of his rivals to put on a real show next year and really close that gap to him. So that's going to be interesting to watch. Thanks, JR, for all your help and insight on this episode. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. You can contact us, podcasts@the-race.com. Let us know what your opinions are on everything we talked about in this episode. Is there anyone in the paddock you want to hear from? Drivers, team personnel behind the scenes, anyone? Feel free to write in and suggest them for us to interview. You can also send voice notes to that email address, podcasts@the-race.com, with any questions or observations you have on IndyCar, and we'll do our best to feature them in the show. If you want ad-free listening of the Race IndyCar Podcast and all of our podcasts in our network, you can sign up via our Patreon. We've also got live shows happening in January for our sister podcast, the Race F1 Podcast. If you listen to this now, there still might be time to get tickets. Go and check out our website. You'll definitely be able to find links there to where you can buy tickets for the shows that are happening in the UK. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.